What if I told you doctors once hammered ice picks into people's brains and called it a cure? The lobotomy, no anesthesia, through the eye socket. Thousands of victims. This is the real horror that inspired American horror story Asylum and the man who made it famous. His name was Dr. Walter Freeman, and between 1936 and 1967, he performed over 3,000 lobotomies. Some patients were children, most never consented, and America called him a pioneer. To even begin to understand how something as savage as a lobotomy could be accepted, you have to picture the world it was born into. The early 20th century was not a good time to be mentally ill. In America and Europe, institutions called asylums were overflowing. They might have started with good intentions, but by the 1900s, they had mostly become underfunded, overcrowded warehouses for human beings. By 1904, the U.S. had 150,000 patients in mental hospitals, and that number was only going up. These places were often compared to prisons, where society's unwanted were sent to be forgotten. Inside, there was almost no hope of getting better. Treatments were really just methods of control. Patients were blasted with high-pressure water hoses or submerged in ice baths for hours. Some were put into risky, seizure-inducing insulin comas, and for the most difficult patients, there were straitjackets and restraints, sometimes for days on end. It was an era of deep-seated pessimism, where everyone believed that severe mental illness was simply incurable. Families were desperate, doctors were desperate, and the government, crushed by the cost of it all, was desperate. The world was practically begging for a miracle, and in that desperation, they were willing to consider a solution so radical, it sounds like it came straight out of a horror story. The story of the lobotomy actually starts in Portugal with a neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz. In 1935, Moniz had a theory. What if he could sever the connections in the brain's frontal lobes, the part that governs emotion and complex thought, to calm the minds of disturbed patients? He called his procedure a lobotomy. It involved drilling holes into the skull and injecting pure alcohol into the frontal cortex to destroy the tissue. The results were mixed, to put it charitably. But in a time with zero other options, even a hint of success was seen as revolutionary. For his work, Egas Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1949, a decision that is still one of the most controversial in Nobel history. The procedure quickly made its way to America, where it was championed by the man who would become its most infamous advocate, Dr. Walter Jackson Freeman II. Freeman was a complicated and fiercely driven man. As the son and grandson of famous doctors, he was intensely ambitious and desperate to make his own mark. He was also a total showman, charismatic, arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own genius. In 1936, Freeman and his partner, neurosurgeon James Watts, performed the first prefrontal lobotomy in the U.S. on a 63-year-old housewife, Alice Hood Hammett, who was suffering from severe anxiety. Like Moniz's original method, it was a serious surgical operation that required drilling into the skull. Freeman believed mental illness wasn't a psychological issue, but a physical one, caused by faulty wiring in the brain. By cutting those wires, he thought he was curing them. His motto was simple and chillingly optimistic. Lobotomy gets them home. In a world where a diagnosis could mean a life sentence in an asylum, that promise was a powerful one. The press called the lobotomy a miracle cure, and Freeman was celebrated as a hero. But he wasn't satisfied. He wanted to streamline the procedure, to make it faster, easier, and available to everyone. And his next step would turn the lobotomy from a complex surgery into something far cruder. Here's the thing, Dr. Freeman was a neurologist, not a surgeon. The standard lobotomy took too long, it was expensive, and it needed a real operating room and a skilled surgeon like James Watts. Freeman hated these limitations. He dreamed of a procedure so simple any psychiatrist could do it, anywhere. In 1945, he got his big idea. He'd learned of an Italian doctor who had accessed the brain through the eye sockets. So Freeman went home, into his own kitchen, and grabbed an ice pick. This was his model for a new, horrifyingly simple technique. He later had a custom tool made called an orbitoclast, but let's be honest, it was a medical-grade ice pick. This new procedure was the transorbital lobotomy. Its brutality was matched only by its simplicity. First, the patient was knocked out, not with anesthesia, but with electroshock therapy, ECT. A jolt of electricity would trigger a seizure, leaving the patient unconscious for a few minutes. Then Freeman would lift one of the patient's eyelids. He'd place the point of the orbitoclast at the top of the eye socket, and with a surgical mallet, hammer it right through the thin bone that separates the eye from the brain. Once inside the brain, He'd swing the instrument back and forth to sever the nerves in the frontal lobe. Then he'd pull it out and do the exact same thing on the other side. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. No sterile operating room, no surgeon, no complex equipment needed. Freeman did them in his office, in hospital wards, and reportedly even in hotel rooms. On January 17, 1946, he performed his first ice pick lobotomy on a housewife named Sally Ellen Ionesco. When he was done, he sent her home in a taxi. His partner, James Watts, was horrified. He saw this new method as a barbaric mutilation, not an innovation. Disgusted, Watts ended their partnership in 1947, leaving Freeman to go on his crusade alone. If you're finding this look into one of medicine's darkest chapters as fascinating as it is terrifying, take a moment to subscribe. We dig into stories like this every week, and your support helps us uncover the truth. Now free from his cautious partner, Dr. Freeman went on a mission. The late 1940s and early 50s became the golden age of the lobotomy, and he was its star salesman. He bought a van, which he actually nicknamed the Lobotomobile, and started touring the country, visiting desperate and overcrowded psychiatric hospitals. He was part physician, part traveling showman. He'd roll into a state hospital and perform dozens of lobotomies in a single day, sometimes using both hands to operate on 2 patients at once. His speed was legendary. During 1 week at a West Virginia asylum, he reportedly lobotomized 228 people. All told, Walter Freeman personally performed thousands of lobotomies, with at least 2,500 of them being his signature ice pick method across 23 states. The total number performed in the U.S. is estimated to be around 50,000. It was a craze fueled by Freeman's relentless self-promotion. And it wasn't just the forgotten patients in asylums. His most famous patient was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. In 1941, at 23 years old, Rosemary was a vibrant but troubled young woman who suffered from mood swings. Her politically ambitious father, Joseph P. Kennedy, feared her behavior would bring scandal to the family. Worried about the family's reputation, he consulted doctors, and Walter Freeman's name came up. Joe Kennedy arranged for Rosemary to have a prefrontal lobotomy performed by Freeman and Watts. The result was a catastrophe. Rosemary was kept awake during the surgery, and when the instrument made its final cut, she simply went silent. The damage was instant and irreversible. Her mental capacity was reduced to that of a toddler. She could no longer walk or speak clearly, and spent the rest of her life hidden away in an institution. The Kennedy family kept her condition a secret for decades. While Freeman was showing off his before and after photos of smiling patients, a much darker reality was setting in. The results were a complete gamble. For every patient who seemed less agitated, there were countless others left profoundly and permanently damaged. The mortality rate was significant. Some records show that at least 100 of Freeman's own patients died from the procedure, though some estimates put that number much higher. For many who survived, the cure was clearly worse than the disease. They were left in what was described as a surgically induced childhood. Many became apathetic, passive, and emotionally numb, with no motivation at all. They were easier to manage, sure, but their personalities, their very selves, had been wiped clean. Patients often had to be retaught how to eat or use the bathroom. Poet Robert Lowell described them as having the dull look of cooled embers. Criticism from other doctors, which had always been there, grew louder. Freeman's showboating and his assembly line approach were increasingly seen as reckless. But the real death blow for the lobotomy wasn't an ethical debate, it was a pill. In the mid-1950s, a new drug called chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine, was introduced. It proved to be incredibly effective at treating psychosis without destroying the brain. It was a genuine breakthrough that made the lobotomy seem not just brutal, but completely obsolete. The number of lobotomies plummeted, and yet Walter Freeman refused to stop. He kept performing them well into the 1960s, on patients as young as 4 years old. His career finally ended in 1967. He was performing a third lobotomy on Helen Mortensen, one of his very first ice pick patients from 1946. This time, the procedure went wrong and Mortensen died from a brain hemorrhage on the table. After her death, the hospital permanently revoked Freeman's surgical privileges. The age of the ice pick lobotomy was finally over. So how does the real story compare to American Horror Story? Asylum, the show's depiction of Dr. Arden performing a transorbital lobotomy, is chillingly accurate. The ice pick-like tool, the hammer, the eye socket, it's all lifted directly from Walter Freeman's playbook. Asylum perfectly captured the atmosphere of helplessness and the absolute power doctors held over their patients. Where the show becomes fiction is with Dr. Arden himself, an ex-Nazi scientist doing grotesque experiments. Walter Freeman was no Nazi. He was an American doctor from Philadelphia. His evil wasn't cartoonish. It was something far more disturbing. The evil of unchecked ambition and misguided belief. Freeman saw himself as a hero on a noble quest. He genuinely believed he was saving people, even as the evidence of the immense harm he was causing piled up all around him. The story of the lobotomy is one of medicine's great cautionary tales. It's a stark reminder of what happens when desperation and ambition get ahead of science and ethics. It forced the medical world to start taking patient rights and informed consent seriously, ideas that were almost completely ignored in Freeman's time. It's easy for us to look back and just see a monster, but the truth is, the lobotomy was born from a real crisis, a time when mental health care had completely failed. It was a desperate solution for a desperate time, and its dark history serves as a permanent scar, a chilling reminder of how easily the line between healer and destroyer can be blurred. What do you think is the most shocking part of this story? The procedure itself, the man who championed it, or the society that let it happen? Let us know in the comments below. You've reached the end of one tale, but another is already calling. Stay with Nightmare Tales and step deeper into the stories the world tried to forget.